But a little bit more on background before I get started, because this is going to tell you, how I got to this point. When I was a young faculty member at Harvard, I was completely intimidated and terrified at teaching there. I was embarrassed most of the time, thinking I really didn't belong there. But I was also like a kid in a candy store. There were so many amazing people and so many interesting things happening. The first thing I did is I went to the medical school to sit on grand rounds so I could sort of hear how doctors talked about really difficult medical cases. I joined a group at MIT that worked on micro machines. And then I started trying to sort of meet different people around campus that I felt like maybe there'd be something I could learn from them, but at least if I just was in their presence, maybe some of it would rub off on me and I'd become smarter or a better teacher. And two of the guys that I started hanging out with, one was a Nobel Prize physicist, the other was a National Medal of Science organic chemist. And it turns out we actually did have a little bit in common in some of the problems of physics that we all were fascinated by. So we would get together on a Thursday sort of like a salon get together for coffee, and we'd talk about different kinds of problems in physics. And somebody different would show up with a problem, and we'd try to work through it. So when it was finally my turn to bring a problem, I brought in a problem that I had done in my dissertation. And in that particular problem, I was looking at, how we think about heat transfer through a wall section. When we think about heat transfer through a wall section, we think about, insulation, we think about thickness, we think about those types of things. But if you think about it from the standpoint of someone who specializes in heat transfer and fluid mechanics, which I did, you don't think about it in that way. You think about it in sort of like small micro movements. You think about it in boundary layers. So a big part of my dissertation was showing that you could perturb or you could act on a wall section such that you could take a single pane piece of glass and make it behave just like it was a big, thick, insulated wall. It's not hard to do. You have to sort of understand the moment at which you interfere with that glass, but it's not hard to do. We don't do that. We go for the big, expensive, double pane, triple pane, or we sort of over-insulate things. But if we really paid attention to how heat wants to move, we can act on it really discreetly. So I brought that problem to these two guys, but I didn't bring it to them as a wall section. I brought it to them as material A with thickness X. With temperature difference, delta T. I laid it out to them as a series of variables. And while I had worked on this for 6 years, it took them about 25 minutes to figure out just what I had spent 6 years working on. But it was affirming because it did tell me at least, I was in the right ballpark. But I waited a couple of weeks after that. And a couple of weeks later, I gave them the same problem again, but I didn't say material, A or thickness X. I said, I've got a wall. I've got a wall in a building, and these are the circumstances. They came to a completely different answer. And their answer was based on, well, in my house, I would put more insulation on the wall. In my house, I would sort of make sure that the sun this faced south, and it got more solar radiation in it. They somehow reverted back to their personal experience. The scientist in them disappeared as they dealt with something familiar. Being in a house, the house they grew up in, or a house like what they grew up on, they could only think about it through, their own personal experience. And it might have been experience as a children, but somehow they completely sort of lost the idea of how you look at it as a problem of science. Instead, it was about what they believed to be so, what we all believe to be so on that. And that's what sent me down on this path, beginning to realize that a lot of the decisions that we've been making, particularly when it comes to sustainability, based on what we believe to be so, or it's based on information that we have that we don't actually have the complete information, we're getting a piece of it, or it's about the way we interpret that type of information. We've made a lot of very, very concerning missteps because either the information's not correct, or the information's not complete, or part of it is actually, this is the way we believe things should be. So this is what I want to talk to you all about, is sort of lay out a series of issues that have caused us to sort of like make certain assumptions in particular directions, and what our takeaways from that should be. So let's see how we go through this. Okay. All right, now I'm going to really cut out a lot of slides. But anyway, information that we have. This is one we all agree on. We know, and this has got great agreement. What's happening to our land and ocean temperature. Pretty much every model, every type of measurement, we get that. This is really reliable information. Let's go to the next chart. This is a chart that deals with the actual sort of consumption that we have throughout the world. And if you look at this particular chart, what you realize is that in Europe and North America, things are relatively flat, but stunning increases taking place in Asia, South Asia, soon to be stunning increases taking place in what we have and what we're starting to see, particularly in Africa and here. Pretty accurate in many standpoints. Pretty accurate in terms of sort of like, understanding where energy flows are. Not so great when we start dealing with areas of the country or areas of the world where we don't have good records, where we have black market transactions, areas that are rural and remote. But on the whole, we kind of get this type of thing. And so what we do know, relatively accurate, but probably underreported on that. Now we come to something like this, and you will find that in many countries, particularly European countries, as well as what we see quite a bit in the US, people will really point to this particular chart in particular, this particular chart. And what you notice is that energy consumption looks fairly flat. Even as population is increasing, the energy consumption looks flat. And so where do people point to this one? Is they say, look at this, the per capita energy use is going down. We must be doing something right. Well, this chart here is flat, that is correct. But are we really doing something right? Actually, no, we are not. Something right is happening. It isn't because we're actually reducing the energy that we use, even insofar as that measurement shows that. Let me show you why. This talks about the kinds of fuels that we use, particularly most of it, going into electricity production. This is the ratio to look at: coal, natural gas. Why that number looks like it's reducing energy per capita, why it looks like total energy has been flat even as population has gone up, has nothing to do with initiatives that we've put in place, has nothing to do with whether or not we've been effective at reducing our energy use. It has everything to do with fuel mix. Natural gas is a more efficient fuel than coal. So yes, we are using less energy in the production of electricity because we've switched fuels. It isn't because of anything else that we're doing. It isn't because of the way that we're designing buildings. It isn't because of the way that we're rethinking the automotive industry. It isn't because of any of those aspects. It is simply that fuel mix has changed. And yet pretty much every country, and this country as well, is sort of like talking about how well we've been doing. Population's going up, but our energy use is not. So we are making big strides. We're not making strides on our end of things. It really is entirely due to this dramatic shift from coal to natural gas. And so a key takeaway from this is that these improvements are due to fuel mix. And the problem we have to worry about is that economies in a transition, this is going to be particularly true as we're looking at China, India, and again, as we start dealing with many of the countries in Africa, coal-based. So it's actually going to get much worse before things get much better or have a chance of getting better. They're not going to have the chance to make the switch to natural gas in the same way that we have in Europe and that we have in the US right now. So another aspect, this is a study that was done around 2005, is like, what have we done in building design that's really made a difference? And so the Department of Energy did this exhaustive study of all their initiatives to see which of these initiatives over the entire lifespan of the Department of Energy made a significant difference in the amount of energy we use in building. $2 billion worth of energy research in that time. They could only find 3 things that made a difference. Biggest thing, with the exception of a couple of us, may not remember how refrigerators used to behave, but there was a dramatic change in the design of compressors for refrigerators. So advanced refrigerators. You have to be really old in here, my age, to remember that we used to have magnetic ballasts for our fluorescent lighting. So from magnetic ballast to electronic ballast made a big difference. And the other thing, the only thing that sort of related to building design itself was going to low emissivity glass. None of the other initiatives showed that it made any type of difference. It was only these 3. This study has been repeated, and since then they've added 2 more technologies. Variable speed fan drives for HVAC systems, and the second thing is now, as we're moving from fluorescent lighting to solid state lighting, it is the fact that much of the solid state lighting, fluorescent lighting was not so easy to get, particularly residentially. Solid state lighting or LEDs now have been the next thing. All of the other initiatives for trying to reduce energy in buildings didn't show significance. Just technologies, again, not the way that we design, simply the kinds of technologies that we select to go into our buildings. What does make a difference? It's a problematic difference within our buildings. And this is something I have talked about, I'd say now for 30 years, starting to get a little traction on. What we haven't been paying attention to is the fact that our buildings are getting bigger in whether we're dealing with square feet or square meters per capita and per function. This is a building at Harvard. Most of the building is corridor and lobby and lounge space. Has more sort of like that type of space than it actually has laboratory space within it. It's actually kind of stunning how little laboratory space is in this building. How much of it is actually sort of like this empty space that we are conditioning, that we are lighting within that. And so the key things to think about in this is that you increase the dimension. This is rule of thumb. You increase the materials by the square. You're going to increase anything that's spatially related, primarily HVAC, but interestingly lighting, because we also tend to increase dimensions vertically with lighting, even though it's a planar field, and a cube. So we increase our need to cool, we increase our need to light, and so we're taking the total energy up every time we make a building a little bit bigger. I push this out another foot, I've really significantly increased the amount I'm spending on lighting or the amount I'm spending on HVAC systems. Yet, that's not what we're measuring. We don't measure sort of like energy per capita, and we don't think about total energy. The number we tend to want to use will be energy per square foot. I make a building bigger, I reduce its energy per square feet. I'm not reducing its total energy, I'm increasing it, but I make it look better on a metric. And the reason it looks better on the metric is that, yes, once I start making a building bigger and I'm serving the same amount of people, I don't have all the heat coming, from adding bodies to it. It's being distributed over a larger area. I don't have all their computers. I don't have all sort of like the loads that come with what having people in buildings are. The best way to make a building look energy efficient, put an atrium in it. Anything that gets rid of people makes a building look really energy efficient
But the reality is it's using more energy. It's using more total energy in order to do what it needs to do. And again, things that we don't talk about, I would say that putting an atrium in the building is probably one of the most common. We talked about sort of like energy reduction strategies because that number, energy per square foot, looks so much better when you do anything you can to take people out of the building. We're not doing ourselves any favor by having those kinds of metrics. This is something I've been talking about for nearly 30 years. Every place I can talk about it, every part of the world I can talk about it. And all I can say, tiny victories. Finally this year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recommended that we change the metric for buildings from energy per square meter to energy per capita. Small move, but finally moving ourselves in the right direction. Because again, we've been looking at the wrong number for years on this. So total energy use goes up, but energy intensity, which is the energy per square foot, has been decreasing, which has led us astray. And so if we start to think as well about the fact that much of this kind of construction is also sort of like happening throughout the world, we saw with COVID, we finally saw sort of like a stemming of the tide, particularly residentially, of buildings getting larger in this country. And I think it's going to be very interesting for us to see with this shift in work arrangements with partially remote, whether it's hybrid, whether it's work from home, whether that's going to have a major impact on our commercial buildings. But what's happening in the rest of the world is that it is building as fast as it can. And as it's building as fast as it can, it's also increasing the space per capita at some of the fastest rates that we've ever seen. I've been following rates in China. The first time I started talking about this, for residentially, it had gone from 4 square meters a person up to 20 square meters a person. In 2000, it was 26 square meters per person. 2015, it was already up to 40.8 meters a person. Understand, 4 square meters to 40.8 square meters is a stunning increase. In India as well, we're starting to see this happen. Average living space in Mumbai, 9 square meters, slum dwellers, 1.5. For the richest 10%, it's 46 square meters. We too are going to start seeing increases like that. So while we might have sort of like slowed down a little bit, we're seeing this pick up dramatically in the rest of the world. Often when I talk about this, particularly, I've done a lot of work in both China and India, I get a lot of backlash on that. And a lot of the backlash is that these are standards that we have enjoyed for years. How dare I even suggest that anyone else reconsider the achievement of the kind of lifestyle that we have. I'm also going to submit to you as designers that we can live marvelously smaller. It's not sort of like the lavishness of space is not what makes a life worth living. In a lot of the ways that we can think about living, particularly in sort of like how we actually see within a space, could be incredibly rich for us, could be incredibly sensual for us. Instead, we go the easy route and sort of been making things larger and larger. So takeaway 2 on this, improvements in spatial energy intensity, the energy per square foot, has obscured the actual energy usage. And our biggest concern is that suddenly increasing space per capita of economies transition. I love Sankey diagrams. And this Sankey diagram is one that sort of includes sort of like all the information we should want to need about how we track energy flows. So we have every type of fuel, every type of sort of input over here. We have every sort of like sector over here, and then the sector breaks down more and more and more. That includes losses as well as sort of like actual uses on it. It's a very good map, but we use this quite often, we miss the most important aspect that it's trying to share with us. The most important aspect on this map is this one. Lost energy. That's an incredible amount of lost energy. Every dashed line in here is lost energy. It's energy that's wasted or given up to heat in production. That lost energy is sort of what's lost. This particular one right here, this giant pile that's lost, before it even gets to where it needs to go, is all in making electricity. And it doesn't matter what you use to make electricity, as long as we're using a turbine-based system, that's going to be the basic sort of loss profile that you have. The issue that we have is that the majority of that is actually going to buildings. So we have already sort of committed ourselves to a stunning sort of like loss of all of these fuels, whether the fuels are coal, whether the natural gas, whether it's some type of oil as a base, whether it's solar, whether it's wind power. We've already committed ourselves to sort of like losing a stunning amount of energy. We don't talk about this loss. We worry about our share there. We don't sort of talk about this very often. So there's a reason why. This goes back, this is an image from the time I well remember. I was working in the Goddard Space Flight Center outside of Washington, D.C. during the oil embargo of 1973, where, you did wait most of the day on a huge line in order to get gas in your car. This was terrifying for people. It was not just sort of like driving that was impacted. It was almost every aspect of living that was impacted. Changed the way that we heated and cooled buildings. It changed the way that we thought about energy on this. It changed the way that we accounted for energy, and the way that we accounted for energy to respond to this crisis we still use today. The concern back then, and it went beyond looking at oil, which is where this started from the oil embargo, was that we really didn't have a good accounting of all of our resources. We didn't know where minerals were, we didn't know what any of this really was, or who owned it. And so there was a real concern about who owns this. Not just where was it, but who owned it, who owned oil, who owned the minerals, where did it really belong? And so that's what started an accounting system that we have, known as an input-output model on this. It's sort of a black box model, which is sort of like, and it dealt with thinking about energy as something you purchase. So what did it account for? The moment cash moved from one person to another person, or from one country to another person. All of our energy accounting is based on where the dollars are paid for either the minerals or the fuel. The reason why we don't think about the losses of our electrical system is they're paid for during energy generation. They might translate into how a homeowner ends up paying their bill, but the actual losses for the fuel occurs where generation is. It doesn't occur where the homeowner is. So the homeowner or the building owner doesn't see that as part of their responsibility. It shows up someplace else. And so all of this accounting, but in fact it's to follow the money. It's following ownership and it's following money. It isn't following how energy actually is used. It isn't following how energy is consumed. It doesn't sort of follow any way that we deal with transforming it or converting it. It only follows the moment at which cash moves from one entity to another entity. Our entire sort of energy accounting system is based on that model. That model has not changed. We have not sort of updated to understand how energy actually flows. We've only sort of like hopped and borrowed and continued to sort of work with that particular model. So if we come back to this, here's some scary stuff that we learned from this. Up top are buildings, and the purple is buildings. Operational energy of building does not include an even greater quantity. There's an even greater quantity of energy that's wasted than what we actually use. Much more energy is wasted before it even gets to us than we actually are consuming. This should trouble us. This should really trouble us. It's a lot more efficient to sort of like fuel, a truck than it is to sort of think about what we're putting into a building. Transportation energy, which includes direct energy, includes a direct energy for construction, but it's also a lot more difficult to understand anything associated with construction that might involve, for example, things like, that I sort of expand in the suburbs. Well, I'm also, putting in for transportation. I'm increasing the transportation use that somebody might have in there. We don't count anything that's associated, and we don't count the direct things. Those all get accounted to transportation. So if it's about construction or things affiliated with building, that gets counted as construction, not the building. But a big area is embodied energy. All building materials are counted to the industrial sector. Again, that's where the money changes hands. If you're going to be sort of like producing steel, the steel industry takes the hit in terms of consumption for energy, not architecture, not buildings. So we don't get charged that. So 30% of all the industrial use actually goes into making and building the building materials. That's a massive number. So we've got operational energy up there, doesn't include its responsibility for this. Transportation energy, part of that is buildings, and a bigger part, 30% of industrial energy is buildings. You pull all that together, what we're using in buildings is more than half. More than half, and yet we're not talking about that. We're not considering that. We're too busy sort of like following just the sort of like the smaller sort of influence of consumption. And so there's something else that happens as a result of this. Because we're only looking at the end parts of this, and what do we know the best about in a building? By far, we have the best accounting of. If we happen to have an oil-based water heater, or a natural gas-based water heater, or a natural gas or oil boiler for heating, we have incredibly accurate information about those uses for space heating and water heating. It's by far the best information we have in the building. Air conditioning, not so much. Air conditioning involves sort of a myriad of other types of processes, not part of our accounting system. But when it comes to heating, water, and heating of space, particularly if we're using a fossil fuel, we have that spot on. And as a result, we had a lot more focus on sort of thinking about that. So you can even look at this chart over here. Space heating. It was just going to be that kind of night. Space heating, 44%, water heating, 17%, and space cooling, 9%. And that includes, what comes from lighting. That doesn't make any sense to us. But it makes sense according to our model. It doesn't make sense in terms of how we account for things. Much of the space cooling aspects belong to another sector. It's not being sort of like dealt with right here. And the reason I included this particular graph here, this comes from the Department of Energy. It sort of recommends what kind of insulation you should have. Because we've been so focused on thinking that our problem is heating, and insulation is the best way to deal with heating, we have dramatically increased the amount of insulation we expect in buildings. We now expect in Miami, Florida, that they should have the same amount of insulation as we used to expect in Maine. Because as we're trying to sort of follow what these numbers are, if we're following the fact that heating's the problem, our logic apparently is such that, yes, we can improve the conditions in Miami if we just insulate it in the same way that we've been insulating for Maine. We've continued to sort of like run down this path. So the next takeaway on this, the codes and standards and strategies have over-focused on space heating
which is, by the way, the easiest aspect to quantify. We know how to sort of like calculate space heating. We know how to sort of like account for water heating. We just don't account for the other things very well. And our big concern is not only is space cooling very underaccounted for, it's the area where we're seeing the most rapid growth worldwide, stunning growth in space cooling occurring worldwide. When it comes to materials, embodied energy, for a long time, those of us who worked in the building industry were told it doesn't really matter that much. Operational energy is so much larger. Well, you know, people started to become more and more concerned about embodied energy materials. We started to see software like Tally to help us sort of understand how we dealt with embodied energy in buildings. We've had a lot of focus on working with mass timber in buildings, so there has been some discussion on it. But it is still something that really, in terms of sort of understanding how the overall industry has been impacted by the embodied energy, not so much. And it was not until this particular report of the IPCC in 2014 was the first time in all the years the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been doing analyses of this, the analyses that we all look to. It's the first time they thought about embodied energy. So embodied energy shows up in that report. It's also the first time they put in a chapter on urban settlements. And what they found in this, and it's a little hard to read this graph, so I'll just explain it to you, is that they've estimated that embodied energy of buildings and associated construction will be 30% of all carbon emissions by 2040, the embodied energy. The thing that we had neglected for years, what was minor, that we tweaked, that we thought a little bit, 30%. Now, they're thinking differently than we think. They're thinking about this as sort of an urban condition, which means they're not just thinking about the steel that goes into the structural system of the building. They're thinking about the fact that this building also needs to connect to the sewer system. This building is going to have an associated sort of impact on our water distribution. They're thinking about all of the types of materials that we need urbanistically in order to support building, which is the way we're going to have to start thinking about things. We can't start truncating what it is that we do bit by bit and only counting for small parts of things. So key takeaway on this, while embodied energy for individual buildings and materials has entered our conversation, the much larger embodied energy of associated construction, all the things that come along with building, has not. And again, the rapid growth and urbanization of the economies and transition are going to dramatically increase concrete usage. Concrete is the most common building material in the world. It's the one where it's readiest able to use. For all the talk about alternative materials, when we're looking at parts of the world that are trying to industrialize and develop rapidly, it's going to be concrete, which means this is going to get much, much worse. So coming to sort of the other aspect that shows up on this, and this is one that's not going to be popular. I don't know that anything I've said has been popular so far, but this one's really not going to be popular. It's the way that we think about the grid. For way too long, way too long, we've been hyper-focused on things like net zero energy, carbon positive, a whole variety of things like that, where we feel as though as long as we use something that is renewable, or we use, particularly something like photovoltaics, we can use that to erase the energy that we're actually consuming on that. Basically, we are playing junior energy engineers, a building at a time, a bit at a time. I'm showing you here, some of you from Austin might recognize this, but this is Austin during, 2020? When did we have or 2021, when we had the massive blackout in Austin. There was a lot of discussion. I don't want to even go into ERCOT. I'm not going that route. But there was an awful lot of discussion about, why wasn't this managed better? All those kinds of things. The grid is unbelievably complex. So here's just a quick snapshot of the grid
that we have in the mid-Atlantic. And what you see here, every one of these dots is a balancing point. And every balancing point has to be not only sort of like it deals with every piece of generating equipment that connects to it. So it's sort of like determining every 15 seconds at one of these nodes, every 15 seconds, it is either shutting equipment down, putting equipment on, or sending out calls for things to be adjusted. It's a constant sort of like response to what the demand is, and sort of every sort of like bit of demand has to be responded to with generation. Otherwise, you have an unbalanced grid, which can fail. So each one of these nodes is responsible for collecting all of the generation that's around that. And then each one of these nodes then has to coordinate with every other node within the grid in order for the whole thing to stay balanced. It is one of the most complex operations that we have. The thought that any individual building should be making decisions about how the sort of like overall grid be managed sort of like beggars belief on this. And mostly what happens is that when buildings are sort of generating fairly insignificant amounts, it's just pretty much ignored on this. It makes very, very little difference to the grid if a building is generating energy. It's not going to be something that they're going to spend a lot of time or effort trying to integrate well into it. Mostly they'll be shunting it off if they have to, but it's not doing a whole lot of good. Yet we use it to do a whole lot of good for ourselves. We use all of that to claim that what we're doing in our building doesn't count because we're supposedly helping the grid. We are not helping the grid. The grid is really a very difficult operation within that. There are ways that, one of the reasons it's so promoted is that one of the things that does come from individual buildings doing some of their own energy generation is it does help to privatize aspects of the grid. It helps to privatize it, and it also sort of like helps to sort of like start to sort of put in some infrastructure. But in terms of sort of like having an impact on really making a difference, it's almost negligible within that. And so one of the key things for us to be thinking about on this is a really general sort of thing in power generation, is that what we really want to do with that grid is operate at the top. We want to operate as high up the thermodynamic ladder as we can. That would be hydropower. You know, hydropower would be our dream to be able to work with. It's about as efficient as it comes. The worst thing for us to work with is a photovoltaic. Nature just does not want to do this. And as a result, a photovoltaic makes much more heat than it does electricity. Most of the rest operates the steam turbine range. Anything below that middle point is making more heat, waste heat, than it's making electricity within it. But this is sort of like our standard right in here. So we're sort of caught with this. The fact that when we start thinking about doing it at the building level, this is really our only choice. We'd be better off if we could start thinking about maybe not making these decisions at a building level, but what if we could start thinking about this at a larger community level? What if we can begin to sort of imagine how we might collectively be able to contribute to things? But as long as we want to make it at a building level, we're stuck with something that actually is probably doing more harm than good. So the takeaway here, it's so poorly understood by most, and decisions at the building level by customers to add to the grid make little difference. Aging infrastructure, rapidly increasing demand, the net zero energy strategies have distracted us from tackling the most difficult issues and have allowed us to both neglect to focus on actual energy reduction as well as delay investment in the grid. So now for a couple of other, so all that just comes from looking at the data that we're given. Now this is for some things that, some other unquestioned sources that have steered us a bit off course. First one being density. We're going to go to Hong Kong, and we look at Los Angeles right here. And this particular paper that was written in the 80s, this image, most cited paper dealing with the relationship between density and transportation. And so you look at this and you think, yeah, it's clear. You know, obviously, you know, high density correlates very, very well with low transportation uses, even though it's only one city. We've got, you know, Australia and the, you know, the US all over here. We have Europe right here, and then we have, you know, a few moving in this direction right here. But this paper has been cited every time someone says, we need to densify our cities. It's the most common metric, you know, sort of like target, directive, or initiative that we see within many types of cities. Boston, it's been a big driver for many of the decisions being made. LA has been a driver for ADUs, accessory dwelling units. We see this occurring quite a bit. So the idea is that if we could just have higher density, we're going to reduce energy. It went from being energy for transportation to energy in general on this. And part of it is that this is what we've heard for ages. We've all read Jane Jacobs. We've all sort of like been concerned about suburbs. And so this fits within our mindset, the fact that higher density means people will live in a way that's going to be less energy intensive within that. You know, because we know sprawl is a pejorative term. We know that sprawl is bad and that density is the answer. So I was on a committee of this planning student who just finished a couple of years ago. And this was a student who started his PhD by saying that I need to show people how important density is in a city for us to sort of focus on it. And I said, well, I can't have you as my student because no good PhD starts off with wanting to prove something. You know, a good PhD topic, you know, emerges because you're troubled and don't understand something. But if you want to prove something, you're not going to be objective. You're going to only be looking at data that supports what you want. And darn it, if he didn't do an amazing job at following the data that he got. He studied 42 cities in the US that had density directives, like a way of sort of increasing density. In 41 out of 42 cities, these are US cities, increasing density resulted in things that are obvious. Of course, increasing density is going to reduce tree canopy. Of course, increasing density is going to, you know, increase impervious surfaces. We get that. That makes sense. An increase in per capita energy use? No, we didn't quite get that. Some of us did. But most people think that doesn't sound quite right, that why would energy go up if you increase density? This one shook people. An increase in income inequality. But this one's particularly startling. It reduced the use of public transportation. So this is what happens when cities in the US are densified. A lot of the densification ends up sort of like attracting wealthier residents. Wealthier residents, higher energy users. Wealthier residents, you know, they might be living high rise, but they're living large high rise. Wealthier residents don't take public transportation within this. And then what happens is because wealth goes up, the poorest segments, the poorest part of the population is forced out of the city beyond the periphery at which public transportation is available. And that's why public transportation use goes down. None of this fits with our value system. We believe that increasing density should be a good. But this particular study began to sort of reveal, you know, just because it correlates with historic cities, transportation density fits for a European city, does not mean that if you increase density, you're going to make public transportation show up. It doesn't mean that, you know, you're going to be able to sort of like allow for, if you're going to be increasing density, The people who are increasing density aren't looking to serve those who need to be served within that. So the things we might believe in don't necessarily translate directly. And what's interesting about this is while he was doing this, Juliana Felkner on our faculty was looking at urban heat island in Austin. She actually uncovered from a very different angle some similar aspects. And one of the things is that those of you who are familiar with Austin know that East Austin is disappearing quickly. The bungalows of East Austin are being replaced by 5/1s as fast as you can get a bulldozer out there. It's stunning to see swaths of these bungalows being torn down as 5/1s come in. They've been hardly endorsed by the city. They're hardly endorsed because 5/1, they're more dense. Now, obviously, having 5/1s everywhere you can look versus bungalows, high density. So their idea is this is a good thing. This is going to, again, reduce transport energy. This is going to sort of, people will be living smaller. Well, what happens is that every apartment in a 5/1 is still bigger than a bungalow. So the bungalows use less energy per capita than any of the 5/1 units use. And then the tree cover disappears. The tree cover is wiped out as you're building the 5/1s. So urban heat island has picked up as well. So even though this was a very different study, not from a planner, but from an engineer beginning to look at these different aspects of it, it's starting to reveal some of the same information that comes from this. That this sort of like automatic thing, like density is going to be the solution, is telling us, we don't quite understand what's going on. And then I think the study that we're really waiting to do, and really needs to happen, is understanding density in relationship to water. Something, particularly of concern here in Texas, as well as it is in much of the southwestern United States on that, is that what does increasing density do to our water resources on this? So a key takeaway from this, increasing density has been put forward as an answer, a solution to affordability, accessibility, sustainability, but correlation, just because it correlates in a few areas, is not the same thing as causation. Density does not cause those things, it just happens to correlate in certain examples within that. We've overinflated its relationship. I would put forth that density is parametric. It's not something that we're trying to strive for higher density, but think about it as being parametric. Parametric from the standpoint that there will be times when increasing density will facilitate doing certain types of things, where strategically done density can help. There are probably locations where increasing density is just going to do harm. We need to understand it as a parametric, what those relationships actually are, as opposed to sort of a blanket idea about that. But then if we start to think about this worldwide, it's, when we're thinking about increasing density in the US, we're still not sort of like seeing the kind of density increases that we're seeing in much of the world. And we start to think about where fastest growth is taking place, Asia, South Asia, and Africa, we're not talking about density in relationship to, just in relationship to transportation use. We're thinking about stunning increases in density. We haven't even come close to sort of grappling with what that is going to do, both for lives, livelihood, resources, all of that within there. All right, let me see if I can speed through. This is sort of like one of my last big points here. So the toughest aspect of all, most difficult one for us to remedy, is the way that we think about greenhouse gases. We think about greenhouse gases in the most simplified way as possible. We think about the focus needs to be on the greenhouse gases in terms of what they trap, and because of that, we think that the largest one is carbon dioxide. So much of our conversation is always about carbon dioxide. That's not how that balance works. This is what the balance looks like. It's not sort of a simple thing, but it's a very complex thing. And two key aspects are neglected when we focus on carbon. Albedo, well, we've been talking more about albedo. We've started to see a lot of initiatives, and I'm seeing this actually every time I'm in a plane, which actually is a bad environmental thing to do, so I apologize for that. But every time I'm in a plane, I see where there's been an incredible expansion in white roofs, sort of a way of dealing with albedo. So it's something we've been talking about. We're not great when it's sort of like looking at albedo at large, particularly for urban areas, but at least we're thinking about it at the building level. The one thing we're not thinking about, the one thing neglected through all of these different things, are our thermal emissions. What are our thermal emissions? Energy and efficiency. I gave you that chart before that talked about high efficiency and low efficiency. Low efficiency conversions emit heat. They emit lots of heat. That's what's being trapped by the greenhouse gases. And many of our ways of thinking, like, I'm doing this to eliminate carbon, at the same time, I'm just going to increase the amount of heat that I'm generating. It's going to be trapped by the carbon that's already there. We're not doing ourselves any good on this. And this is our biggest problem in terms of thermal emissions. When we start thinking about our air conditioning systems, every condenser is emitting heat. And it's heat at the level that it cannot escape. It is being trapped. And so this is a sort of an amazing thermal image, looking at what's coming from the condenser. If you're paying attention to what's happening in the world, the rate at which we're adding space cooling, therefore condensers, is stunning. So I'm just even talking about the condensers here. I'm not even talking about in power generation, the cooling towers, all those different types of things. All of those are sort of in the same thing. And energy conversion creates heat. That heat is what's being transmitted, is what's being trapped there. And nobody's quantifying this. It's come close. There's been some recent work at NASA where they're first starting to sort of like track what these thermal emissions are. I think this is going to be the most exciting area for us to sort of work on and really get a good handle on, so we can explain that, you might think that, by having a LEED certified 8,000 square foot house that you slap some photovoltaics on, that you've done good. It takes 3 times as much energy to move heat out of a space than it does to heat it. It's a stunning amount of heat that we are moving out of our spaces. The more space that we cool, the more need that we have for cooling with all of these types of emissions that we're heating everything up. We understand it when we think about urban heat island. It's one of the main contributors to urban heat island. We don't understand it as we think about sort of like the context of the world. And sort of it takes us back, to this particular thing again. Anything that's not 100% efficient, which it's impossible for anything to be 100% efficient. Heat, 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 heat. And when we start thinking about cooling, the most inefficient process we can do, it's heat, heat, heat. So 3 times as much coming out from that. I'm going to skip through these, but this just shows all the different kinds of energy conversions and where they are. One of the things I've always encouraged students to do is that, if you think about what we really need, then there's actually sort of different categories of conversions. We want to go to the most efficient conversion for the thing that we need. Really, the only things that need alternating current that we have are going to be refrigeration and compressor air conditioning. Things that deal with rotation really prefer alternating current. But alternating current, our grid, is like the universal donor in blood. It's high quality energy. We can use it for everything. So we use it for everything. The fact that we're taking, I'm going to go back to the photovoltaic example, the fact that we're spending so much energy, creating so much heat to work with a photovoltaic that will integrate into the grid. First of all, photovoltaics don't make alternating current, they make direct current, but integrate it back in the grid, so we're having to lose another 25% to make it fit into the grid.
when actually we could be using solar energy to heat water. That's a process about as efficient as you can get if you're dealing with solar energy. So the idea of this particular chart is, get the lowest quality of energy in terms of, the exchange within that, most efficient energy for the most efficient task. Alternating current can do everything. Direct current can do quite a bit. Fuel cells, batteries, photovoltaics all make direct current. Geothermal energy, you can get space cooling, water heating, space heating, solar radiation, directly used, fantastic for water heating and space heating, ground coupling in this source. We should be working from here up. Instead, we don't. We just sort of like, let's worry about alternating current. Doesn't matter how inefficient it is. We can use it for everything on that. So takeaway number 7, I have one more takeaway, and then we're going to be done. Carbon, because we've been so focused on carbon, it's prevented us from addressing a significant building contribution to radiative forcing, and that's heat as a thermodynamic penalty from all energy conversions. And here is what we really need to be concerned about. There's a feedback loop between the heat we emit by cooling, the rapid increase in cooling technologies, so the additional technologies that we're adding throughout the world, and then their contribution to urban heat island, so they keep feeding back on themselves. They're accelerating the heating of our planet. We're accelerating the heat of the planet by this type of sort of approach that we've been using on this. So I'm going to give you an example, one quick example that I always do with first-year students. And it's an example that after I had that strange experience with the 2 professors at Harvard, I waited a couple of months and I took this example to them to see how they would respond to this example. And again, the first time I took the example, it was abstract. The next time I'm explaining it to them as I explained it to you. I start with a box. It's a 10-foot by 10-foot by 10-foot box. It's a perfect cube, and it's adiabatic. And I hope everybody knows what adiabatic means, but in case you don't, it means it's perfectly insulated. It's a completely insulated box. And the idea of this is I put something in this box, which means that whatever heat is emitted by its energy conversion will only heat the air. It's not heating the walls because they're adiabatic. So it gives us a real sense of just how much heat every single energy conversion that we have in a building gives off. So first thing to put in there, what happens with 70 degrees? I left a 15-inch MacBook Air in sleep mode on. Well, the temperature goes up a little bit, not much. What if it was idle but the display was on? Goes up a little bit more. What if I put in a mini refrigerator in there for an hour? Temperature goes up to 76 degrees in there. What if it was Energy Star rated? Okay, better, 75 degrees. What about a desk lamp with a 60-watt incandescent bulb? Yeah, 81 degrees. What if I put an LED in there? Okay, better, 72. What about a person sitting for an hour? 90 degrees. What if they were dancing? 176 degrees. And by the way, if you want to sort of think about this, I don't know if you follow the work of Sarah Jane Pell. She's an amazing performance artist who's really interested in sort of like, environmental sort of, both environmental contamination, but sort of what's happening to the environment of the human body. And Sarah and I were having dinner one night, and she was telling me about this particular installation that she had done, and her idea of doing this installation where she's sealed inside of this sphere was to see how long it would take before the carbon dioxide she exhaled, depleted the oxygen in the space. Said she was going to do it until she faded. People were standing by. And said she's never been able to do that because what happens is the heat builds up in there so fast that the heat builds up much faster than the oxygen is lost in it. And so she never occurred to her that her body would create so much heat. How much time before it was unbearable? inside of this, and this is like understand inside of a building, we're not putting this out in the sun, 10 minutes. How much heat was coming off of her body in this entire space that had to be contained within the shell, 10 minutes. So here's his next one. What if the south face of the box was glazed with single pane glass? How hot would it be after an hour of sun around noon? And I picked today, but my nap is from New Haven because this is where I last taught this class. What does anyone think? How hot would it be in here? 1 hour of sun. One wall glazed. How much heat is coming in?
A lot.
We don't even conceive of how much energy is contained in the sun. We can't even mentally grasp it. When I took this example to the two professors, they argued with me on it. Well, that doesn't happen. That would never happen. Well, of course it doesn't actually happen because walls aren't 80 about it. Every building material is absorbing that heat. Everything is absorbing that heat. That heat is still there. And when you're cooling a building, you're going to have to get that heat out.
Is this calculated or is it experimentally determined?
Oh, calculated. Zeroth law calculation. Thermal inertia. Straightforward thermal inertia. And this might give another example. So this is another sort of like not calculated. I spent some time at a research facility in Cuernavaca, Mexico. Most of their focus is on solar energy. And this is a parabolic collector. My shoulder comes up to about the middle point of there, on there. So you can get a sense, it's about room sized on that. This is what it could do also at the end of the hour by concentrating solar energy. Cut metal, cut stone, cut this hole in brick. There's a stunning amount of energy that takes place within the sun that we don't harness well at all. We harness in the most inefficient way that we can. It would be incredible if we could use it for hot water heating, many ways for hot water heating. But what we do is somehow think it's a good thing to have lots of it in our buildings. We all studied, we've all studied terms of l'été, l'hiver, summer, winter. This would produce the image about, hey, in the wintertime, we want full sun coming in. In the summertime, we really don't want so much. It doesn't matter to us that shows exactly 2 seconds of the year. What happens, 1 second on the winter solstice, what happens at 1 second on the summer solstice. I sit on a lot of AIA juries, and I would say they're all required to do sustainability diagrams now. Everyone includes an image like this. One example, 1 second of the year of how their facade design is. What we do with our buildings, we don't realize how much heat we're putting into our buildings because, again, all of the building materials are absorbing that heat, and we've got air conditioning systems carrying it out for us. It's a stunning amount that we do. So this is actually my last slide. The takeaway. Many standard practices that we have in architecture come from precedents we don't question, or from our own personal observations that we equate to fact. Many of these practices are difficult to dislodge. This one, the one I showed in particular. We don't make progress until we're willing to step away from what we believe. Also, side note, our field really doesn't understand the sun, how solar energy works on that. If I were to think about how I use solar energy, I would start thinking about it from a district standpoint. I would think about how communities or neighborhoods could actually sort of like share in terms of solar hot water heating. There's a lot of things that we could be thinking about. We're going to have to start thinking about energy systems beyond the boundary of a house, what works at different scales, what other types of things we have to include within it. Again, I'm talking about water when I start thinking about density. It's hard work for us. It's really hard work, but there isn't anybody out there doing it. We really need to be doing this. So I'm committing to you that in the next few years, I'm going to be trying to fix our accounting system.
And I'm particularly going to be focusing on getting a really good handle on exactly what we're getting from our thermal emissions on that. A former colleague of mine at NASA is working on that as well. So I'm hoping we're going to be able to make a difference there, getting better information to you. What we need from you is imagination in terms of other ways that we can start thinking about how we reduce energy, what we do in order to sort of like think that we can start layering within spaces in terms of its thermal conditions, what we can do to start minimizing material use, not just on a building by building level, but begin to start rethinking what communities and different types of communities should be like. What types of resources can we share at different places? There's a lot that we could be thinking about, and we need to be thinking about all this. Anyway, thank you for staying. I'm sorry about this opening mess to all this. Like I said, it's been a while. Being a dean, you're out there raising money. You're not paying attention to what's on your computer. So thank you for putting up with that. Thank you for staying, and good luck to you all. But we need you. We really need you. So,